I think if I was in charge of a company now, what I would be saying to them is, look, I'm all for the diversity and inclusion agenda, but if you think it's ticking boxes and just having people, who might look different from each other, gender-wise or ethnicity, fine, great, sexuality, fantastic, but it's also about what's in here. And true diversity is divergence and diversity of thinking. And what better way of embracing that than through employing neurodiverse people who just bring that extra dimension? I think that embeds true diversity.
Hello, Sam here. Welcome to Working to Work, an interview series exploring the real-life challenges of obtaining and maintaining employment in the UK as a neurodivergent individual, and what might be done to mitigate these issues. So as someone who's navigated this path, I understand many of the emotional and psychological hurdles involved, and in 2022, in the aftermath of a particularly difficult moment in relation to work, I realised that my challenges weren't unique to me and that many others with the same conditions or characteristics, needs and behaviours, etc. face similar hurdles. So that's when the idea of Working to Work was born, as a platform for individuals like us to share experiences and potential solutions, and in doing so raise awareness, hopefully empower people, reduce shame, and contribute to the conception and implementation of a more accommodating world of work for neurodivergent status individuals. So, welcome to this first episode of Working to Work. For this episode, I spoke with Sir Robert Buckland, who is an MP, currently leading the governmental review into the low rate of employment amongst the autistic and wider neurodivergent population. So this episode is going to be a bit of an anomaly in terms of the tone and dynamic and the aspect of creativity I wanted to imbue into future episodes, as in offering the guests an opportunity to express themselves in a creative means. But for this episode, I thought, with the opportunity to speak to this MP who is doing work very much aligned with the focus of this Working to Work project, I wanted to use that time to extract as much information as possible. What is that information? I wanted to learn through talking to Robert what the government's intentions for this review are, and also what a review even is. Like, what is a governmental review? How does that work? How do they go about it? How will it include autistic and neurodivergent status people in the process? Will it? Expect to hear Robert speak to these points in this episode. One thing I wanted to point out is throughout this episode, I kept using the word neurodiverse as opposed to neurodivergent. And I know the difference, and it annoys me to that I misspoke to the point that I went and edited the audio to say neurodivergent instead. But then on reflection, I think recognizing this error but not feeling the need to cover it up is healthy. I like this idea of not this is a good example where my mind can't seek the word quick enough to keep the sentence flowing, but that's okay. But my point is that things aren't perfect, that there is no perfect, and that misspeaking and not being able to find the exact word that you want to use at that point, they're not necessarily errors that need to be fixed. In fact, I find it quite comforting to see, and charming in a way to a degree, when I see reflected in others aspects of myself, and that would include getting things wrong sometimes and having difficulty recalling words. So while I think this kind of neurodivergent mix-up is relatively common, and Robert does it as well in this episode, I know that dyslexia plays a part for me in how I manage and sometimes mismanage words. And so many occasions I've like cursed myself when I've reviewed cover letters I've written after sending them and realized that I wrote a different word to the one I intended, even after proofreading it. And I think about how poorly that might reflect on me. But I want in this series to empower people and reduce shame. So I want to start with myself with that. So all that to say, when you hear neurodiverse and it doesn't sound right, just know that I/we mean neurodivergent. And another thing, a bit of a acronym demystifying, when you hear DWP mentioned, that's the Governmental Department for Work and Pensions. They run the job centres, deal with benefits, the benefit system, etc. So let's get into it. I started the interview by asking Robert to introduce himself and speak to why he's leading this review.
Well, Sam, thank you very much for having me on the programme. I'm MP for South Twin, Conservative MP. I've been a former minister and cabinet minister, including being Lord Chancellor. But for many, many years, I've had a great interest in autism and the challenges facing autistic people. The reason being is I'm a parent of an autistic person, and having been through the mill, if you like, of working out special education and then entitlements and other benefit related issues, I feel that having lived that experience, that I wanted to share that and do my best to help other people who are struggling. And I am now once again chair of the all-party group on autism here in Parliament. And some months ago, after a request I made to the Prime Minister, I was given the task of chairing an independent review into autism and employment, and a review that focuses on the obstacles that many, many people face. As you rightly say, fewer than 3 in 10 adults have jobs. That's autistic adults. That's people with a diagnosis have any form of employment. And that's way below not just the neurotypical average of 8 out of 10, but the disability average of 5 out of 10. And it seems to me that that isn't the fault of autistic people, it's the fault of the system, and indeed the lack of awareness and knowledge that employers and the wider economy, I think, needs to have in order to realise the potential that you and I know autistic people have. So that is really the genesis of the review. And that's what we've been working on over the last few months.
Great, thank you. So when you're going into this, I'm curious, do you have a hypothesis of what the potential problems might be that you're looking to find evidence for and seeking solutions to? Or do you approach the review with kind of a blank slate curiosity and just seeking information that can then be synthesized into solutions?
I think a bit of both. I don't want to lose time on this, and it's tempting to have a massive sort of let 100 flowers bloom approach and to have a review that will take years. I don't believe we need to take years. We need to do this in months, and I want to get the report published in the autumn because I think we know a lot about what good practice looks like, and we also know about bad practice. And it's the job that I have, together with the team of civil servants and the DWP who are working with me, and the autism research charity Autistica, as well as the other organisations in the field. Together, I think we come at this from an angle that knows that it is about practical change on the ground that will make a real difference here. And therefore, what I want to make this review about is not just an end in itself, but the beginning of a process where we can spell out what change we think is needed and then monitor it so that we are holding not just government, but the wider economy to account when it comes to the what is far too low a figure at the moment, in which we need to see dramatically increase in the years ahead.
Yep. That makes a lot of sense. I'd like to get to the objectives later on, but first of all, for those that perhaps don't have an understanding of what a review is, a governmental review, including myself, I don't think probably to a lot of the public, it's clear what these reviews, how they work and how they're set up and what ultimately how they impact the cause that they're there to address. Can you give a bit of a sense of like what a governmental review is?
Yes, thank you very much. Well, first of all and foremost, it's independent. I have been a minister and was until recently a minister, but I'm not a minister. I'm an independent backbencher, conservative backbencher, independent of government, and therefore able to look objectively and sometimes critically at what has gone wrong as well as what is going right. And I hope this report won't pull its punches when it comes to some of the things that I think have not gone well and which we need to do better. And it's that independence that is so important to me and indeed to Autistic and the other organisations that have been helping with this review. It's my job to try and make sure that any recommendations that we make are implemented by government, but fundamentally, the independence of this process and its integrity is very, very important to me. And its review is based upon what people say, what their evidence is. And we've had a call for evidence, which has involved a lot of organisations with expertise in the field, other people as well with knowledge and lived experience of autism, and most importantly, autistic people themselves. My belief is that this has to be led by autistic people. Any changes have to be shaped by them, for them, with them. It's no good trying to do things to autistic people or for them without their involvement in shaping the architecture. And that for me has been a really important sort of mission, if you like, in all of this, to remember nothing about us without us. And that I hope will shine out from the report when it is finally published.
Yeah, when I've spoken to people about this upcoming interview and asked what you would want to ask yourself, they've said, "How will autistic people be included in this?" And it's perplexing in a way that sometimes solutions are sought and reviews are undertaken that don't focus on the experiences of those affected by it. Because just in a kind of purely practical sense, it seems that those would be the people with the most insight into what isn't working.
I agree. Now, I don't have a diagnosis of autism, and that's because I've never been diagnosed or tested. But plenty of people in the review do, and leaders of the review from Autistica are autistic themselves, and we have plenty of voices there, who are really making themselves heard. And I would like to think, when it's finished, this is going to be the product largely of autistic people themselves. Designing something and doing something for the benefit of other people in that situation. I'm not talking about it always as a problem, but as an opportunity and as potential, and as the new. Whilst I've focused it on autism, this does have a wider neurodiverse application. And I want to make it clear that my interest isn't just autism; it's neurodiversity generally. But I see a lot of parallels here with what we're doing with autism, which can help a lot of people with other conditions on the neurodiverse spectrum.
Definitely. And I think there's a lot of overlap as well. As someone with like multiple diagnosis, my personal feeling is this is my brain, right? And different aspects align with different like characterizations of different conditions. But fundamentally, like I think a benefit is one, understanding themselves, and others being open to understanding different individuals and their needs. And I find that interesting in a way that the governmental review is framed as for autistic people. What was the rationale behind that when the literature does mention a neurodiversity in the neurodiverse community, but doesn't explicitly mention kind of people that are dyslexic or have ADHD or dyspraxic, which again, there's like overlap in terms of some of those needs. And I think the challenges in terms of obtaining and maintaining employment.
No, there was a big debate about that. And, I certainly started on the basis of looking at the wider neurodiverse community. I think what we thought in the end was actually focusing on autism made the target, if you like, the focus of the review, a really tight one, and one that could be managed well over a short period of time, but always with a ready acknowledgement that this was going to have applicability in other fields of neurodiversity. And ultimately, as the evidence has gone on, the real thing that's come home to me here is that we need a universality of approach. In other words, changes to be made, let's say, to an interview process that would affect everybody coming into the process, not just autistic people. Because here's the thing, Sam, there's a lot of people out there who are not diagnosed, who perhaps don't even realize that they might be on the spectrum, and we might never know. And therefore, it seems to me that, changing practice to allow for that rich diversity, what I call real diversity of thought, is going to be a better way, not just of helping people with a diagnosis, but capturing everybody who might not self-identify or even think of themselves as in any way neurodiverse.
Yeah, definitely. This was a question I wanted to ask you, actually, and you pretty much answered it there. But I was curious, how might the government, excuse me if I'm like looking down at some notes from it, which is helpful. I was thinking, how might the government or the DWP support autistic or neurodivergent people who haven't been diagnosed as autistic or another neurodivergent status condition, but also struggle with those same challenges? Because I think in terms of employment, it's important that there's fundamental structural changes, but that kind of understanding of one's own needs and what's going wrong. Can be a lot of like self-blame, I think, for the individual if things aren't working out, and they can't necessarily even attribute it to challenges in kind of communication. And when I say challenges in communication, I mean bilateral challenges in communication, as in as opposed to it being on the point of the neurodiverse person. So I wonder how I think that kind of answers that effectively these changes will be across the board and will benefit those potentially that don't have a diagnosis or have an understanding of the sense that their minds work in a certain way, but that maybe makes them feel different, but that isn't wrong or
exactly so this isn't just about recruitment, it's about retention as well. And therefore making those reasonable adjustments, in the interview process, whether it's, questions in advance, whether it's actually, if it's a task-based job, being on the floor, on the shop floor, the factory floor, showing, show and tell and seeing, how an applicant does the job, making sure the job description isn't so rigid that you don't get the best out of a person. And then understanding that, if somebody has a bad day, they have a bad day. It doesn't mean that they're a bad employee. It happens in other types of walks of life. And I think, getting employers to understand that and to make adjustments will, I think, increase not just the well-being of individuals who get work, but overall productivity within the economy. And I think, the other point of this review is that whilst it's morally right to help autistic people, it's also economically good for the country more widely, because we are talking here about tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people who are affected by this and who are currently not working. The government rightly talks about this a lot, this economic inactivity point. Well, here's a way that we can help solve some of the problem by empowering employers in the private sector in particular to do better and to recruit in a more savvy way.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the autistic population potentially have extraordinary skills as well that potentially the neurotypical don't. And I don't mean that in a kind of savant sense. I mean they're just skills that potentially don't exist, or ways of doing things that can be incredibly beneficial, as you say, for the individual, but also in terms of the economy and the well-being of society as well. The sense of kind of purpose and inclusion that comes from that. So I think it's right to speak to there's multiple facets of benefit that can come from greater employment in the neurodiverse population.
Yeah, no, I entirely agree with that. And if people are saying to me, "Oh, this problem's too big to solve," I don't agree. I think obviously you made the point about comorbidities and different conditions, and whilst there are a lot of friends and people we know who are at the one end of the spectrum who I think could, with reasonable adjustments, walk into very good jobs tomorrow, we mustn't forget that there are people out there with a number of comorbid conditions. They might have they might be autistic, they might have learning disability. That's a big challenge. How do you place and how do you recruit and retain people with those comorbid conditions, some of which might be physical as well? I'm not going to pretend that's easy, but I think if we start, in a more concerted way to create a universal good practice and an index, if you like, that everybody can use, then that will come. I think the more that people see the merits and the potential of the neurodiverse mind, then I think the more people are going to say, hey, you know what, what have we been missing here? We should have done this years ago. And that's why I think that, it's no good saying, oh, it's too big, too difficult. You've got to start somewhere. And I hope this review will be a start to this important process.
Yeah. So given the way you're conceptualizing this, do you kind of envision a future where it's not necessarily about the autistic or neurodiverse individual going into an interview or this process or while they're working, articulating that they're autistic or they have these certain needs, but that there's a greater understanding in the workplace with employers that there are different needs and why certain behaviors are as they are, so that the person is treated more as an individual as opposed to having to kind of highlight some difference? Because to a lot of people, I think, to myself previously, I wouldn't have an understanding of what certain conditions were, even if someone told you and you had the best intentions of wanting to support them.
Yeah, I entirely agree.
There's a lot of onus, I think, on the individual is, I guess, what I'm saying, whereas maybe
exactly.
It's not necessary in a progressive sense.
Exactly. It's no good asking, are you autistic? It's what do you need today? Do you need a bit of quiet time? Do you need a couple of hours in to where you can really concentrate on your work? What do you need? It's those sort of needs that I think actually then answer the question, don't they? Without saying, put the label on. There we are. That's fine. We've done what we're required to do. That's not how I envisage this at all. And fundamentally, it's sort of, I think you've asked the question, because the burden shouldn't be always on the autistic person, because that's in effect asking them, well, why do you want to work? Why should you work? The question should be, why not? And that really came home to me only yesterday. I was in my constituency visiting a local organisation, a hospice organisation, which has a very big volunteer force. And although this was a voluntary job, the young woman talking to me had disabilities, and she said, the question isn't why should I work, it's why not. And I thought that was so well put. It's still stuck in my mind. And I was telling her about the review, and she was very excited to hear about it, because she, like thousands of other people, have a part to play and have something to contribute and have a value. And it's understanding that value and unlocking it, which I think will be so good for employers and the wider economy.
Definitely. And I think the dynamism of British business and the British employment, I don't know what you'd call it, landscape, because I think from my own perspective, neurodiverse people can have different ways of looking at problems that can be incredibly beneficial and to that organization. But sometimes the way that's interpreted by others who don't have that kind of way of thinking is that it's a critique, that they're being challenged, that this isn't constructive. Whereas I think, at least from my own perspective, it's always generally coming from a constructive place of wanting to understand so you can do a better job. So that, and I think we're losing that if we don't kind of honor and appreciate that different way of thinking, that dynamic kind of like lateral thinking, maybe seeing how things fit together. And
I think you're absolutely right. And it's that's what true diversity is. Diversity of thought. We might all, we might look different, but do we think differently? And that's what I'm interested in capturing, that thinking differently, which can really add a dimension to a business, and particularly, small businesses. I think a lot of autistic people, really want to be entrepreneurs and have their own business. It's not just about employment; it's about that side of it. That can be very challenging, but we've got to find better ways in which we can empower autistic people to set up their own businesses and work. Very often that's how they like to work. That's how we like to work. And I think understanding that, leaning into that would be also something I'd like to see more and more of.
Well, yeah, that's what I'm curious about, whether this review will also look at like structural issues in terms of like what work is available. So is a potentially a challenge for employment for autistic people or neurodiverse people in general, that the opportunities out there don't necessarily like maximize their strengths, that maybe there could be opportunities or programs created that better enable and offer the support and the context necessary to create something novel, because I think that is another kind of a gift that many neurodiverse people have, is kind of being able to conceptualize novel ways of doing things and potentially new businesses that could exist. But a barrier potentially is the funding, knowing how to do that, having the means to do that. If you're underemployed, you don't necessarily have the finances to float yourself during a period of development. I wonder if this review will look at like what, not just what can be changed about what, or iterated, but fundamentally what is rethink employment in a sense.
I think I'm not going to pretend the review is going to answer all these questions. What I think we're focusing on is, it's probably good just to remind ourselves of the terms of reference. I mean, I think all of that is absolutely on the money, and I think we need to develop that, as we progress from the review, in terms of, monitoring progress and working out, how to improve those opportunities. But the key issues for me, it's not just, as you say, about the onus on autistic people. It's on how employers can already identify and better support existing staff who are autistic in the workplace. That's as important, I think, as anything else. What more can be done then to help prepare autistic people effectively for beginning or returning to a career? So I think that sort of advice and tailored support seems to be relevant there. And then working practices or initiatives that would reduce stigma and improve productivity. Again, focusing very much on what works, but it has to be acceptable to autistic people. It's got to be effective at improving their outcomes, and it's got to be feasible. We've got to be realistic. I can't suddenly ask Rome to be built in a day, but I think we can deliver something that will be a progressive change. But it has to be monitored, and working out how we do that is going to be a really important next stage, I think, after the report is published.
When you mention preparing autistic people or helping them to prepare, how do you think of that in respect of people that, like we spoke about, haven't got a diagnosis, don't have an awareness of what neurodiversity is, but are struggling to find work, feeling that they are doing all they can, but it's not working out, that they have the ability? How does this review potentially help them in a way, or how might it?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that's really challenging. I think the point is answered by my increasing belief that universality of approach by employers is where we need to go. Because if you don't know you're autistic, or you don't think about it in those terms, how do you prepare? And that's why I think working out, there's two things. One, employers adjusting some basics on the interviews, rather than it being an ambush or a sort of, memory test. It should be about what's the potential of this employee. Let's, make sure that they know what they're going to be asked. Let's do, some practical work with them during the interview, so they can see for themselves what the job entails. And then secondly, I think that the universality approach means that not only do you capture, the people who are coming into interview, but when they're in work, going back to the point we made about, instead of asking the question, are you autistic? What support do you need? What adjustments can we make? Are you happy with your desk space? Does it work for you? Or do you need somewhere less, with less sensory overload? All those important questions that you and I know are key for autistic people, which many employers just wouldn't think about. And it's getting them to think about what they don't do well at the moment, which I think will better capture those who don't have a diagnosis.
Do you think there's an aspect of this that maybe HR departments need to be more informed by maybe more include employees that are neurodiverse in some way, so they have an innate understanding of and be able to pick up on signals without necessarily someone necessarily having the language to communicate that, because especially in a stress situation, it's not always possible to articulate what's going wrong. And if one is speaking to someone in HR that doesn't kind of have that awareness or empathy, it can be extremely challenging. And to an extent, like I think kind of upskilling or kind of informing those people in that role already what to do only goes a certain way if they can't kind of connect with that person on a level that can really make them feel heard and understood, and not kind of we can do this for you. But does that make sense?
No, it does. And I think in the larger HR departments, there's less of an excuse because, surely the larger the organization, the more chances that autistic people are going to be there. And I see some really good examples of this. I think the insurance industry is a really good example of how the big players have really started to nail this. The work that they're doing, on autism, I think is impressive. And I think they've long ago realized the fact that a neurodivergent brain will, get to conclusions and solve problems much more quickly in many respects. So I'm really impressed by the work that they're doing. I also think there's great potential in law and financial services. In fact, I'll be meeting leading lawyers later today to talk about, autism in law and legal services. Again, I think huge advantages, how we make that better and how we spread that out. And therefore, I think the solution is, even for a small company, just to have access to something like an index that is government approved, which is, built by autistic people for autistic people, that they can use with confidence. And they can apply, rather than just applying it to the diagnosed person, also thinking, well, heck, actually, this is going to be good generally. Let's use this generally. Let's use this index and help other employees who might not have a diagnosis, but clearly are struggling with, the work practices and the way in which things are structured in that particular office or workplace. So yeah, I think in a nutshell, the answer's definitely yes. That I think HR departments can do more.
And just picking up on that, I think actually potentially the more autistic people in work, well, there's more opportunities potentially for them to be working in HR as well, not just to be serving the neurodiverse employees, but also why not be, you can do this role as well. There's many people you can connect with. And I think autistic people could support neurotypical people as well, because as you say, kind of needs and needs. What is it that you need, especially having an understanding of being someone that has certain needs and they have maybe been unmet. That person would be like even more sympathetic and able to be effective in that role. So
I entirely agree.
Just thinking about different employment sectors, I remember doing some research last year and found out the construction sector had a high percentage of neurodiverse employees, and I found that interesting. Have you found different sectors that do better or have higher rates of neurodiverse people?
Yeah. I mean, I've mentioned insurance. I think it's interesting you mentioned construction. Again, I think you can see why, because it's very project based. It's all about, focus on a particular, a process or making progress and refining and improving that process, whether it's actually in the construction itself or in the planning. Clearly, I think, there are opportunities for the neurodiverse mind there. And I'm glad to hear that. I think that I don't want to sort of point the finger. I think that overall, I still think there isn't enough of an understanding of the potential. Or if there is, it's only very much in patches in certain areas, maybe, or certain people might be involved in an organization and have the understanding. Now, whilst that's great, and it's wonderful to see inspired people showing leadership, that's not going to be enough to touch the sides when it comes to the sheer number of people who are not in work, because it's not a couple of hundred. It's tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people who are just, not working. And therefore, it's going to take something more systemic, I think, to change that. And that's why this review, I hope, will be of real significance when it comes to the need for systemic change.
You've touched on some of the reasons already, but I'm curious, like, what are the things that you feel are barriers that are making the autistic employment rate so low? I mean, maybe from your own experience, but then also that's come because this review started in April, am I right?
Yes.
So it's been going for a while. So I imagine that you've already kind of done a lot of work on it. What have you found, and does it align with what you kind of went into it thinking?
The universality points really come out very strongly. I think that.
Can you just clarify, just for anyone listening, what do you mean by that term?
What I mean by that is making an adjustment for everybody so that you then capture people who might be diagnosed, who might not be diagnosed. So it's not just about putting autism in a box and saying, you're autistic, we're going to deal with you, you're going to go down this path. Yeah, and that doesn't seem to me to be either right or feasible, frankly. So that's really come home strongly. I think, secondly, there's a temptation to get down I think, a bit of a cul-de-sac about quotas and trying to work out whether you do a carve-out and you have a minimum. I'm not sure that's right either, because you're not then capturing the non-diagnosed, because, by dint of that, they're not fulfilling the classification. And then thirdly, I think that it's the retention point that is as important, because, getting somebody over the threshold of an interview can be really challenging. And, one bad experience can put an autistic person off, the whole thing. That's a sad reality. But then what is worse is getting the job and then finding after only a few weeks that it's not working. And there's no attempt by the employer to really understand that, to lead into it and to make adjustments. And it's that bit I think we've got to get right, because I think the truth is a lot of people, autistic people who are not working, will have had some experience of work, but it won't be a good one. And it makes it much more difficult for them to feel able to sort of stand up and come back into the workforce. And that's what I want to change. A lot of positive stories about autistic people staying with organizations for many, many years. Loyalty, a sense of belonging, sense of stability is very, very important for a lot of autistic people. Not for everybody, because I never stereotype autism. When you met one person who's autistic, you've met one person who's autistic. They're all, as you said earlier, they're all unique, and you've all got different characteristics and different, interplays, which is why, you're Sam, you're not just an autistic person, you're unique. And your mind is unique, and it's getting that across as well, which is, not just important for the economy, but which reflects true diversity and understanding. So some big themes emerging, but ones that I hope we can translate into practical proposals rather than something too theoretical, which isn't going to help anybody.
No, and I think having a clear, concise sense of what you want this to achieve, and it not being too expansive, and then ultimately achieving nothing is a sound way to do it. Because recognizing this is a what do they call it? Not a sprint, but a kind of, what's the long distance?
Marathon.
A marathon, yeah, exactly. And it is a marathon, but like one that we want to be like starting and making progress. Just thinking about, you spoke about people struggling in interviews or getting opportunities and then finding it's not working and then being out of work. Thinking about the DWP as it operates at the moment, from like I'm 37 for context. I've never sought support from the DWP. I've kind of worked and had multiple jobs, or it hasn't worked out. It has for whatever reason. After this difficult experience last year, where I was working at a company doing very well, everyone commended the work, but I had kind of more kind of psychological and kind of challenges in terms of like being at the place as opposed to kind of the work itself. I saw, as I say, like rethink what I'm doing. I thought, okay, what are these problems? I want to make something that kind of speaks to this and speak to other people. But in part of that, I wanted to then really think about, okay, what do I want to do work-wise next? What will work for me? What will feel gratifying? Where can I best utilize my strengths? And going to the DWP, asking for, okay, could you support me during this time in a sense of like, while I'm looking for work? It's very rigid at the moment. But what effectively they come back with is basically, sorry for the noise. It's quite warm today, so I have to keep the window open. When you're searching, you need to search for work effectively and find the first job and take this. And if you don't, kind of, then we can't support you. And despite trying to express, okay, the nuances of my situation, there isn't any leeway in that. And I don't think that is conducive really to both like the emotional and gratification of that employee, but also again the economy and the productivity of the country, because then you're asking people to take any job that maybe doesn't work for them on an emotional level or a spiritual level or a kind of strengths level, but it doesn't work in terms of utilizing their strengths in the economy if they're being asked to take anything and not kind of, there isn't kind of more tailored support. But people do need to obviously survive and have some, if you haven't got kind of financial support through that period or savings, it could be challenging. So I wonder like if there's an aspect of this review that looks into, while autistic people are looking for work or thinking about how to create their own projects, what kind of tailored support could the DWP offer? And again, to people that maybe don't have a diagnosis, how can they interpret what that person in particular needs and is looking to do with a bit more nuance to be able to support them in an individual sense?
So a lot there. I think there are aspects of that we're obviously focusing on access to work, which is the program that you get if you to get physical or other assistance in order to maximize your potential. We think that's very slow and a bit clunky, and it doesn't respond quickly enough. It takes months sometimes rather than days or weeks, which is no good if you're trying to chase a job that needs to be filled now. Secondly, I think a lot of that is to do with the interplay between benefits and work. And although it's not part of my review, I know that Mel Stride, the Secretary of State, is looking at ways in which, more generally, disability benefits don't have to fall off a cliff if people are getting into work gradually and are moving more and more into full-time work. In other words, there should be an interplay between the two, that you don't suddenly lose entitlement because you've got a bit of work. Now we know the PIP doesn't necessarily operate like that. It's designed to, as I always say about PIP, it's about the disability need. It's not about the income or it's not about the income of the applicant. It should never be. It's about their need and about how you can, help them access mainstream life. But there's no doubt there's an anxiety out there that people feel, oh God, if I'm going to get a small part-time job and I go over the certain hours, it's 16 hours, I think it is, isn't it? Suddenly I'm losing a lot of, income. We've got to change that, and we've got to reduce that anxiety, because, I know anxiety is a big factor that affects the lives of many autistic people. It's one of the things that goes with the autistic mind, is that, anxiety can be a real, it can inhibit so much activity because the mind is just full of anxious thoughts. And therefore, whilst it's not strictly speaking within the terms of my review, I think that inevitably those questions will be asked, and we will be able to, once we get this review and the report published, start to ask those questions as well, to make sure that barriers are being reduced. Because the last thing we want is employers turning around and saying, look, we'd love to employ this person, but because of the particular interplay of benefits and government rules, it's not going to work for them financially. It's because they're going to be worse off, and that's clearly is not right.
Yeah, and I appreciate, like, I don't want to veer too much off the review. I want to keep it on this, but an autistic person might come with, I've got this idea, I want to create this initiative, I want to create this business, and if in the kind of strict DWP operation at the moment, it doesn't allow for that necessarily. There isn't the kind of a forwarding of, well, here's a program necessarily that could support you financially through that, and not just financially, but like structurally, in terms of like some support to set up aspects that maybe aren't your strength. Because you might have a particular strength that isn't setting up a business, but once the business is set up, or your initiative, it can flourish. And there isn't necessarily that kind of support or framework, I think, available, or it hasn't seemed to me, I haven't heard of one, that can enable people to create opportunities for others, as opposed to kind of seek opportunities with those who have had the ability to set up something.
That's really interesting thought. I think sort of developing the point, as to how access to work could, develop really and change in order to embrace those sort of concepts. Again, though, of course, the limitation would be it's going to only apply to people with a diagnosis, which isn't. I mean, ideally, what we want is as many autistic people as possible not being in a position where they have to rely on the DWP for that sort of thing. But there's no doubt in my mind that the jobs coach system, which I think has worked very well for lots of people seeking work, could be further refined, perhaps with jobs coaches with an autism expertise or training. That means then that they know how to identify particular issues. And even if the person hasn't got a diagnosis, they can say, okay, well, clearly there's a neurodiverse issue going on here. Let's see whether this is going to work. Bearing in mind some people might be able to work for a long period of time, and targeting those people seems to me to be really sensible. So yeah, I think those sort of ideas are well worth pursuing. Once we get through this review period, and let's see what it brings and what further obstacles there are that we need to break down.
Yeah, definitely. And from personal experience, I know that doesn't exist. I specifically asked for that and explained the needs of why, especially like someone, a neurodiverse coach, job coach would be beneficial, yes. Or someone at least that you're communicating with about your progress that has an understanding. And yes. Despite, I feel I had the ability to convey that need. And yes. The DW, for whatever reason, in my experience, just couldn't meet it at that moment.
Okay.
Conscious of time, so I just wanted to speak to you a little bit about the practicalities of the review. I know we touched on it, but so in a practical sense, what do you do, and what do the kind of the organisation involved as well?
Yes.
And how do you practically go about seeking the information? And then before we wrap, I really want to get to like what fundamentally the kind of what would be the metric of success in a way of this review, or what the outcome would be?
Yeah. Really good questions. Okay, so the review, as I've said, is independent. I chair it, but I'm supported by a secretariat of senior civil servants at the Department of Work and Pensions, working alongside the team from Autistic, the leading UK research independent charity. And it's that combination of those independent, non-governmental people working with civil servants that is allowing us to create a structure here that is focused, it has terms of reference that we agreed at the beginning, and which has yielded a very productive call for evidence. We've had what we call a targeted call for evidence, where we've encouraged specialists in the field, employers, autistic people, to come forward to provide some written evidence, which we've received online. We've had many hundreds of submissions. And we've also topped that up with a lot of roundtable events, some in person, a lot online, which I think has been really good, particularly for autistic people from other parts of the country who aren't able to travel. And those events have been going on right through the spring, and they continue through this month as well. The aim is to produce a report, I hope in October, which will have a series of recommendations, numbered recommendations, many of which will be to start work on various initiatives, to work towards, frankly, the creation of some sort of central index that employers can use with confidence, that is supported by government, which contains advice and information about the adjustments that I think should be made in order to improve interview experiences and then retention of employees. Now, how to measure that's going to be the question. What about the progress? Now, in my view, October is only the beginning. I think over the next 6 months to a year, we need to be working out, monitoring how far we've got on delivering some of the recommendations. And then we need to start looking at the figures to see, over the next year to 5 years, what impact these changes are going to have or are having on those numbers. And unless we see those numbers creeping up, between now and the end of the decade, I'll be deeply disappointed. I want to see, at least 1 in 5, or 1 in 2, 5 out of 10 autistic adults in employment, just as other disabilities are as well. And we need to get on with that sooner rather than later. And ultimately, it would be lovely to see that figure even higher. But this will take years, and I think it's difficult for me to sort of put a figure on it. But it's this decade, I think, which is the decade of opportunity where we can make a real difference.
September, October, a review is authored, and then
Yeah.
from the next year or 5 years, it's monitored in terms of how successful it is. Would it potentially involve new legislation or amendment to the Equality Act? Like, how would that be implemented?
Yeah, yeah. I don't think it needs legislation. I think that the Equality Act already covers disability and autism as a protected characteristic. And instead of taking a lot of time on legislation, which it would involve, I think this is all about monitoring practical change and making sure that the DWP, although this is going to be as much about the private sector as it is about government, in fact, if not more so, that the DWP have a genuine handle on where the numbers are going, where the figures are going, and they are alive to the need to make adjustments to improve that, or to do something to directly help, as you say. But ultimately, this is for all of us, a wider society, I think, as much as it is for government. But I accept your point. The key here is that we've got to be able to measure it, and there has to be a regular, if you like, sort of accessible, I don't know, like a scorecard or a dashboard, which is the current sort of fad in government, where we can see progress year on year and measure it. That seems to me to be very important.
Yeah, I'm still curious, like how the government basically impart this information or these suggestions on employers or support autistic people in a practical sense post review, and to then see whether it's working.
Yeah,
in a practical sense. How does that work without legislation in a way?
Exactly. I mean, I do think we can, via online information and a campaign, we can help to make employers more aware. I mean, DWP did the Disability Confident Awareness campaign, which I think in some measures been good. I'm critical of aspects of it. I don't think it has reached far enough, and it's not been as sustained as I would have liked it to be. But we can learn from that, and perhaps using the same networks and widening that out, we can then really spread awareness and access to materials that employers should be using in order to maximize opportunities for autistic people. When people say legislation, well, hold on, we've got the Equalities Act. At the moment, the Equalities Act applies, and that we know can be a very useful tool in ensuring that employers are discharging their duties under that act. So I mean, I'm not against new legislation. If I think it would be necessary, I will certainly campaign for it. But at the moment, what I'm trying to do is something more direct and practical that we can achieve more quickly in order to see change.
Do you think if the government changes, how might this affect these type of reviews?
I'm hoping that I've spoken to the opposition spokesman, and I think they will be supportive. So I don't think this is a party political, happily. And once I do the review, I'll certainly brief them on it, make sure that, if they do win, that they are mindful of it and they know that the work must carry on. And certainly, I don't know what role I'll have in public life then, but if I'm still around, which I hope to be, I'll be writing to them anyway and saying, look, this has got to carry on, and how can we make it happen? So, yeah, I think we'll be okay.
Good. Yeah, good. That's reassuring to hear. Do you think there's an aspect of like public education that needs to be undertaken in terms of like potentially normalizing different ways of communicating and different needs and a greater understanding potentially that doesn't necessarily to be linked to autism in particular, but a kind of appreciation of the diversity of human minds and communication? Employers and individuals can do so much. Like the colleagues and the environment one exists in that plays a big part in how someone feels at a job, in an interview.
Yes, I think if I was in charge of a company now, what I would be saying to them is, look, I'm all for the diversity and inclusion agenda, but if you think it's ticking boxes and just having people, who might look different from each other, gender-wise or ethnicity, fine, great, sexuality, fantastic, but it's also about what's in here. And true diversity is divergence and diversity of thinking. And what better way of embracing that than through employing neurodiverse people who just bring that extra dimension I think that embeds true diversity. So, and that's how I would sort of go into a boardroom and sell the autism agenda. And I think through this review, I'm hopefully going to be doing that on a national scale and making some waves here. Throwing a big rock into the pond and seeing what's going to happen. That's the aim.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to end. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Sam, and good luck.
Right, so Working to Work has liftoff. I'm grateful for Sir Robert Buckland giving his time to talk with me. I still feel a little in the dark about how in practice the review works, but I'm planning to speak with a representative from Autistica, which is the organisation collaborating with the government on the review, and perhaps can glean more details there. The thing that stuck out for me from this interview was the desire to take a universality approach. And I feel this is of particular benefit to those that may exhibit neurodivergent behavior and thinking, but perhaps don't have the awareness into what the specific needs that they have in relation to employment challenges are. Or those that maybe wouldn't actively advocate for their needs because either they're apprehensive for whatever reason, or they don't have a diagnosis that they feel would validate it, their requests, or even knowledge or an awareness of their potential conditions or the notion of neurodiversity. There's more, I think, to go into on this topic. So I'm curious to hear what you think regarding the universality approach. I haven't given it a huge amount of thought, so I'm not sure whether there might be blind spots that I'm missing where taking this approach doesn't offer some of the benefits that are more kind of that an alternative way might. So yeah, do comment or get in contact with me through email. Thank you for listening to this first episode of Working to Work. In future episodes, going to speak more with individuals that have lived experience of the challenges to obtaining and maintaining employment, and get into the weeds, so to speak, of what those barriers are and how they might be broken down. So I look forward to that. And thank you for listening, and thank you for watching if you're watching on YouTube, if you're listening on Resonance, or if you're listening in the podcast feed. I really dislike the word feed. It makes me think of kind of a trough for pigs. Nothing wrong with kind of pigs eating, but just kind of, it makes me think of this sludge that's served up for you to indulge in, or kind of feed I don't like. Maybe your just podcast, I don't know. I'll come back to you on that. Next episode we'll figure out a better term than feed. Until then, thank you. I've been Sam. I still am Sam, and I'll be Sam in the next episode as well. Ciao.